Allison, are you going to go first?
Yep, Alyssa, I think you can go.
Oh, Alyssa, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to wait a second longer. Or should I go?
I think we're ready to go.
Okay, all right. Bonjour, everybody. My name is Alyssa Studi, and I'm the manager at Red Cliff's Minobemadaziwan Tribal Farm. And here at Minobemadaziwan, we recognize food and agriculture as an important piece of tribal sovereignty, and we're dedicated to supporting the needs of the Red Cliff community. Yes, we're working to advance the food sovereignty goals of Red Cliff in a variety of ways, which includes increasing access to traditional foods. And so we are really excited that GLIFWC is working on this model food code project. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the happenings at the farm later on after the webinar is over. Miigwech.
Hi, everyone. Bonjour. This is Philomena Quebec. I'm a policy analyst at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I've been working with Owen and some other staff at GLIFWC on this project for the past 2.5 years. And what we've done is we've developed a model food code that is, the whole goal of this is to support tribal sovereignty and the use of traditional foods to support tribal economies and Minobemadaziwan, like a good way of life. So I'm really happy and excited to present this about this project, and very interested in hearing feedback from tribal members. Miigwech.
Bonjour, my name is Owen Schwartz, and I'm the community dietitian working on this project for Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I've had the honor to work with GLIFWC for a little over 7.5 years now, working on various food-related projects, and it's been really enlightening experience. And like Philomena said, we're excited to bring you this information. So thank you all so much for making time for this webinar today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know you are all in listen-only mode. If you have a mobile device or an iPad, you may have to tap your screen to see your function buttons, but you'll notice that there's a raised hands button, a chat button, and a question and answer button. If at any point in time you have questions, please let us know through the Q&A button. And if you're having any sort of technical difficulties, if you could put those into the chat. So we'll have staff monitoring the chat for any issues that way, and we'll have additional staff monitoring the question and answer section for questions. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Today we have a few topics we're going to be covering. We're going to take a look at a snapshot or an overview of our entire project and food systems. We'll take a quick look into eating venison, and then we'll talk about harvesting venison in reference to requirements, biological and chemical contaminant risks. Then we'll take a deeper look into the model code around venison, and that'll include licensing classes and food safety for commercial harvesters. And then we'll wrap up with some information on upcoming trainings and then an opportunity for question and answers. So this is our GLIFWC Chippewa Ceded Territory Traditional Food Regulatory. It is a 3-year project, of which we're currently in the last year, and we're actually in the last 6 months of the project. So we're getting pretty close to the end here. This project is funded by the Administration of Native Americans underneath their Social and Economic Development Strategies funding opportunity. So we're very excited to be a part of that. The overall goal, and I'm not going to read it directly off the slide, the overall goal of the project is to create model food codes around traditional treaty harvested foods, which are foods that are fished, gathered, or hunted. And this will provide an opportunity to expand sovereignty over tribal food systems. And so when we mention the word food systems, we'll talk a little bit more about what food systems means. But we're providing tools, not only the codes themselves, but also training, which we'll talk about later, and scientific information to help create tools that can be used for tribal food regulatory system enhancement and development around treaty harvested fish, game, and plants.
So one of the important things that we want to just talk about as a beginning point is that this, this project, and like many of other GLIFWC's other projects, is it's technical assistance to the tribes, but it doesn't create tribal law. We wouldn't be enacting tribal law or making the rules. That's up to each individual tribal council to do. And so we'll be providing this toolkit, which would include the model code, to the tribal councils, and we'll be presenting that to to Red Cliff Tribal Council, talking to them, getting input and suggestions and incorporating changes. But really it would only be applicable if your tribe decided to enact it. And certainly things could be changed or modified. Certain things could be taken out. The lawmaking authority continues to reside within the tribe. How we've written the model code is to really have it, it's really about commercial activities that aren't available for tribal members right now. It's not going to affect the uses that we have for traditional foods currently. So, certainly traditional foods are a really important feature of any naming ceremony, of funerals, of welcoming baby ceremonies, things like that. And this is not going to affect, that in any kind of direct way. And it's also not meant to affect informal commercial sales that happen on reservation, if, fundraisers, powwow stands, things like that. What it's really about is about expanding the opportunities for tribal harvesters and food processors to get into areas that aren't available right now. Like currently under the off-reservation codes and the agreements with the state of Wisconsin, for instance, tribal members can only sell whole carcasses of venison. They can't sell any kind of ground products or cut up steaks or anything like that. And so with the adoption of a food processing code that addresses meat processing, this is something that tribal members could get into. So it's not about changing anything that's already happening, but it's about providing opportunities for really new economic activities. So what is a food system? Owen, are you there? So part of a food system is when we talk about the food system from an international commodities perspective, the first step in the food system is growing the food, or when you're talking about animals, raising an animal in order to prepare it for eventually being butchered, then harvesting it. Food gets packed up and taken to different places and processed and packaged into, safe products that can be transported out to consumers through a retail market. And each of those people and processes that are involved in those activities are integral to the to the whole food system, turning resources into food. And we're going to do a little poll right now and just ask you to participate in this questionnaire, and let us know what your role is in the tribal or local food system. That poll is going to pop up. And if you just want to, there's two questions. One is about your role in the local food system, And you can check on multiple choices, all of the choices, if you're involved in everything. And then we just want to know about the audio and the speed of the webinar. So if you could answer those questions.
Yep, and it looks like we do have some folks responding. Sorry about that with the microphone. We have about 50% of respondents. We have about 2 more folks, so just let us know how everything's working. We'll give you about 10 more seconds, and the poll should just appear on your screen. So just click your response and you can click next. And we're going to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. And so we'll go ahead and launch the poll so everybody can see the results. The results should be appearing on your screen right now. And so it looks like we have 1 harvester for personal use and that we have 2 food handlers for a program setting. So really nice to know who's out there. And then it looks like we do have 1 consumer and that the audio is working good for everyone so far. So wonderful. Thank you so much for participating. It's nice to know a little bit more about you guys and nice to know that everything seems to be working out there. So we'll go ahead and close this out and we'll move on to our next slide. Thank you again.
So what is a food regulatory system? And this is the kind of the background infrastructure, the legal framework that protects the health and safety of consumers by creating standards related to food safety. When we look at the United States system right now, there's an emphasis on 3 categories of food safety risks: biological, chemical, and physical. So an example of biological contaminant would be something bacterial like E. coli that can cause illness in a human being and potential serious illness. And so this is something that as a food handler, you're gonna want to make sure that any kind of E. coli risk is effectively managed. Chemical is some kind of chemical component, like it could be maybe one area that's of concern is that in a food processing plant, cleaners and disinfectants are placed in a location where they're not going to spill onto food or food surfaces to cause any kind of chemical contamination, which could again lead to illness or harm to a human being who consumes the food. And then physical contaminants are things like metal shavings or hard pieces of rock, something that you could bite on and hurt your teeth, or it could, if like you swallowed a wire or something like that, it could cause injury inside of your digestive tract. And so, the regulation that we're looking at is we're not looking at intentionally grown agriculture in terms of food that's grown in a farm or animals that are raised for food, but really it starts at the point of harvest because that's our traditional food system, and so harvesting those foods. From that point, they get, foods get picked or an animal gets harvested out in the field and then transported from the field to a location where it will be processed. And all those kinds of steps in terms of transportation and storage and keeping things cool and how they're actually processed are really the meat of the food code that we're going to be talking about today. And then after things are processed up in a way that they're, ready and available for market sale, then, that's when they would be distributed and consumers could purchase them or trade for them or, simply eat them if we're talking about like a place like a Head Start program. So what our project includes, it's three parts. There's a food code, and the food code is based on traditional ecological knowledge, the way that our Anishinaabe people have been harvesting food and preparing food for a long time. And then we've also supplemented that with information on contaminants that could be potentially concerning in the traditional foods we're focusing on. Some of this came from research that had already been done. And then in the 3 years, we also conducted some original research related to food safety, where that information didn't exist. And then we'll also be providing for for food handlers and for regulators safety procedures that they can implement right out of the box in order to make this make this project more doable.
So let's take a look first before we dive into some of the harvesting and food safety issues as to why we'd want to choose venison or Waawaashkeshi-Wiiyas over something more conventional like beef. So we're just going to take a quick look at the nutritional information. You already know that venison's a delicious and healthy meat. And so I just want to give you some numbers and some more information about what makes it so healthy. So venison is considered a lean meat, which means it's high in protein and low in fat. And if you look at the nutrition information over on the right-hand side, you'll see that about an average 3-ounce cooked portion of venison, which is 4 ounces raw, is only 160 calories. So this is a really low caloric number for compared to some other types of beef steaks, which we'll see in a few minutes. And if you look here at the total fat, you're looking at about 3.5 grams compared to the 30 grams of protein. So it's a pretty large divide between the amount of fat versus the amount of protein. Venison's also high in iron, which we will see here on the nutrition facts. It's about 25% of your daily value of iron. And iron's important for carrying oxygen in the blood. Helps to oxygenate all of our muscles, which help our muscles move and help our muscles activate. And then it's also important for brain development for infants. Venison's also high in zinc, which is important in these days. It's about 70% of our daily value of zinc, which is really high. Zinc is important for immune system, so it helps keep the immune system strong and healthy, and also helps to grow and repair body tissues, so such as muscle, other types of body tissues such as bone and different types of muscles. It's also high in B12, which you'll see here. It's 110%. So even one serving of venison is even more B12 than you need in an entire day. B12 is important for nerve health and also blood cell health. And B12 is a component in making DNA. So really important when we want to create new cells in the body or if we have growing young ones in us. Venison's also high in riboflavin and niacin, which you'll find right here next to each other, 45 and 40% respectively of your daily value, so a little under 50%. And both of these B vitamins are used for converting food into energy that we use for our body. So without those, we might not get very far without some of these B vitamins to help convert that food. So just some information on how venison is a healthy and nutritious food. So a quick peek at its comparison to beef, which is something that we typically have more access to, especially in some of our program settings. So if you look on the right-hand side over here, we have a beef flank steak, which is a pretty lean meat. You can tell here, it's also 160 calories, about the same serving size for venison. It is a little bit higher in fat, even for it being a leaner cut of venison, and it is a lower in protein as well. And we can see that it's about 15 daily value percentages lower in iron. So just overall, again, that venison is healthy and nutritious. So let's look at venison compared to maybe a more average cut of beef. We'll take a quick look at beef ribeye, which is known for its marbling. It's fat marbling, which makes it a little bit juicier, a little bit easier to cook. For those of you who've cooked with venison, you know that if you overcook venison, it can get really tough. That, you know, sometimes, especially when we grind venison, we typically add fat, which is going to change the calorie content and fat content, but we typically add fat to make it a little bit easier to cook with. So looking here at the comparison to something that would naturally be higher in fat with a beef ribeye steak, we're looking at the same size, serving size here of 3 ounces cooked, 84 ounces. 84 grams, you're looking at a 240 calories. So that's almost an 80 calorie difference right there. And we're looking at a much higher component of total fat. And we're also looking at a lot higher saturated fat here too, about 5 full grams higher than our venison. And we see that the iron is much lower. And we also see that the protein's a little bit lower too. So we can see here how venison can kind of stack up compared to all the different cuts of beef, something that would be a little bit fattier and something that would be a lot more lean. We're still seeing the venison coming out as a very nutritious, comparable, and maybe even a little bit superior to some cuts of beef. So just something to keep in the back of your mind as we move forward here today.
No,
and now we're going to touch.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, now we're going to talk about harvesting deer. Go ahead, Philomena.
I love this picture. My daughter did finish her hunter safety last year. She loved it. So certainly if you're going to be hunting in the ceded territories, you're going to want to read through the applicable regulations. You know, these are available at the GLIFWC website, and they're also available at your, I think they're available at your tribal website too, and certainly your tribal natural resources department. But on the GLIFWC main page, this is the GLIFWC main page, the harvest regulations tab is where you're going to find your hunting regulations for your off-reservation areas. You're going to click that. It's going to take you to this page, and then you're going to click on the big deer head for big game hunting regulations. And here's where the regulations are. You know, right now I can't remember if I believe the permits are not available online. You have to still go in and get your permits from the natural resources place, but from either your natural resources station or the GLIFWC station. But you can certainly use our online system to register your hunt after you've killed anything off reservation. All deer need to be registered after they have been harvested, certainly for any kind of off-reservation hunting. I'm not sure how it is on reservation for Red Cliff. Hunters, you also have to participate in hunter's education and firearm safety class, unless you fall under one of the exceptions. And, you know, there's things change over time. So make sure you're in touch with your GLIFWC wardens or your tribal wardens to get information about, you know, all the updates and any kind of permits that you're going to be needing when you go out hunting. You're going to want to have your hunting permit with you and on your person before you shoot any deer off reservation.
So all foods come with a certain amount of risk, and it's important for the harvester to be aware of what the most likely risks are and how to reduce those risks. And it's also important for our consumers to know that as well. However, these next few slides, we're going to look at it a little bit more from the harvester side. So when we think about venison, we think about two different categories of food risk or concern. And one of those categories is biological, and that includes chronic wasting disease. Also includes bovine tuberculosis and E. coli. And then we have a chemical concern as well, which is lead, which is typically from ammunition, and we'll talk about here. So we're going to take a deeper look into each of these.
So chronic wasting disease it's a protein disease. It's highly infectious, and it's spread among deer, moose, elk, that, you know, those four-legged and antlered kind of animals. It has not been shown to jump to human beings. There's a species barrier, apparently, but a similar disease called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or mad cow disease, was transmitted to human beings in in Great Britain, and it's a very, very similar disease. And so there's concerns that CWD could also jump to human beings at some point. It results in a chronic and fatal disease. There's no cure. And one of the really, it's a very concerning disease, but one of the problems with this is that the transmission vectors are unknown. It's like I said, it's highly transmissible, and the prions, the infectious particles that the deer have within their body that makes them sick, are present in their urine and feces and saliva, and so and certainly within a dead carcass, there's quite a bit of infectious prions, and so it makes it's spread environmentally. It appears, and so that makes it really challenging to deal with. Here's a slide that shows current cases of chronic wasting disease within the United States and Canada. This is available at the USGS website, and it's the most updated version of this map. And it shows all of the known CWD sightings since for quite a long time, and there's also information about how it became known to be spread across the United States. And so if you're looking for the most updated information, please check out the USGS website. GLIFWC also maintains a website, and it's at data.glifwic.org/CWD. And on this website, you can see all the detections in relation to the tribe's ceded territories. This website is updated in the spring or summer of every year after all those known infections came in through the fall and winter. And as you can see, there are some areas within the tribe's 1836 ceded territory and an 1842 ceded territory. There's quite a few captive facilities that have CWD positive animals, and these are active. Most of these are active locations. They continue to house deer there, and they continue to test positive for CWD. And some of those are, there's a few areas where deer have been known to be infected with CWD, and they're in the wild, and that's the gray areas. So, there's a few spots within the ceded territories that have some CWD within the wild areas. Mostly it's clear within the wild population. I'm sorry. Mostly it's clear. And so, where if I believe that Red Cliff, a lot of deer hunting occurs within, the northern counties up here. And there have been no CWD detections within those counties, but CWD testing is available for all tribal members, regardless of where they've harvested their deer.
Our second disease of concern is bovine tuberculosis. This is a bacterial disease that can be transmitted from cattle to deer and can then be transmitted to humans through bodily fluid contact or inhaling bacteria from infected lungs. So any infected lungs, inhaling any of those particles could potentially infect humans. Of all the tuberculosis cases in the US annually, bovine tuberculosis represents about 2% or 130 people annually on average. So the risk is not zero, it is there. Currently in ceded territory, there's only one location that is known to have an active bovine tuberculosis management area. And that is slide here over to the right. It's in the upper part of lower of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, so right over here. So if you know of any hunters, or if you're a hunter that typically hunts in this area, that's something to keep in mind too. And we'll talk a little bit about that on how to protect yourself. So in ceded territory, this is the only known area. This is a disease that is monitored by both the state and state natural resources and GLIFWC, and I believe some tribal natural resource offices as well. So every year before you go out and hunt, taking a look to make sure that where you hunt is not currently a bovine tuberculosis zone is still a relevant and important thing to do.
So tribal natural resources departments and the GLIFWC Biological Services Division works on monitoring these diseases and other wildlife diseases within the ceded territories. For chronic wasting disease specifically, the Voight Intertribal Task Force has created a tribal wildlife disease and invasive species management area. And that's about, it's south of the area where CWD was known to be within the ceded territories is south of the Lac du Flambeau Reservation in parts of Oneida County. It's within 4 different deer management units, and you know, and so within, if a tribal member is harvesting deer within that area, there are additional regulations related to transportation and testing of any deer that's harvested in that area. So again, you know, if you're going to be in that area harvesting deer, make sure you keep track of that. And then certainly testing is available for chronic wasting disease for all tribal members. And you would just need to bring in your carcass for a tribal wildlife biologist to extract it. You can contact GLIFWC's Biological Services Division for more information about that. Or else they also take heads of deer with 6 inches of neck, because the lymph nodes on the neck are the things that are tested and sent in for testing for CWD.
So there are ways for the hunter to protect their health when we look at these 3 concerns. When it comes to bovine tuberculosis, and again, this would be pertinent for those areas known to contain bovine tuberculosis, or for bovine tuberculosis to have been found. When it comes to field dressing an animal, it's important for the hunter to cover their nose and mouth with potentially like a breathing mask or some other form of breathing barrier, and that will protect the hunter when they're working on the lungs, throat of a deer or near the mouth. If you look at the picture on the right, this is a picture of very infected lung tissue from a deer that has been infected with bovine tuberculosis. It's important for a hunter to be able to identify the signs of bovine tuberculosis and to know what that might look like. For chronic wasting disease, if at all possible, get your deer tested. As Philomena mentioned, there is free testing available to all tribal members, and states have increased their efforts as well. So there may be a state-run free testing site near your hunting location, and so that's important to look into before you do hunt. It's also important to decontaminate equipment that may have come into contact with any deer that are reasonably believed to have chronic wasting disease, such as potentially in a chronic wasting disease management zone. The best tool that we have for that right now is specifically for stainless steel, but we could also, it wouldn't hurt to give it a try with plastic as well. But a 50% solution of 50% bleach and 50% water, and then soaking those materials, especially the stainless steel, for 5 minutes. Now, it's important before putting any equipment into this solution to make sure that it is clean and free of any fat, muscle tissue, debris, anything like that, that these items are already clean before they're going into the solution, This solution has not been seen to be effective or not been found to be effective on actual tissue. So you couldn't take your roast and soak it in this solution. It would not be effective. But for our stainless steel knives and our stainless steel equipment, cleaning it very well first and then putting it in this bleach water solution is the best known way to decontaminate and disinfect CWD or equipment from CWD prions. And then E. coli, this is something that's already present in the deer. It's found in the intestinal tract. We have most mammals, we have it as well in our intestinal tract. And it's important for the harvester to have washed and clean hands whenever they're doing any sort of field dressing, and especially before eating and drinking any of their own food out and about while they're hunting. Before field dressing, it's important to clean off fecal matter before cutting into the carcass to avoid contaminating meat. And we'll talk about some other ways to kind of reduce E. coli during the field dressing and processing of venison. For our chemical concern, lead is a serious concern, and this is something that comes directly from the ammunition. So ammunition selection is important, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But we wanted to give you some information related to Wisconsin and associated with lead. So lead is found to affect children's behavior and their intellectual development. We have sensitive populations, and those are children and then women in childbearing ages. Childbearing women, the lead can cross the placenta and impact the nervous system of the growing fetus. Lead has also been known to cause miscarriages, stillbirth, and infertility in both men and women. And there's no safe level of lead in human food. So there's no level that's been deemed safe by the FDA for lead in human food. So to talk a little closer home, this was done in Wisconsin, and this was done in 2008, and it was conducted in partnership with the Health and Human Services and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. During that year, they obtained nearly 300 samples from 5 food pantries, 6 meat processors, and then hunters throughout the state of Wisconsin. 15% of the ground venison that they purchased or that they obtained samples from the meat processors contained some amount of lead, and then 8% of the meat that they obtained from hunters contained some amount of lead. It's important to note that in 2008 and during this study, the amount of meat that was donated into food pantries during that year only represents about 2% of the deer that was harvested in Wisconsin. All the venison that goes into food pantries comes directly from a meat processor. So that system, typically a harvester or a hunter will harvest a deer, and then they'll take it to a meat processor and say that they would like to donate that meat, and then that meat is then processed by the processor and then donated to the food shelter that they are in connection, that they have a relationship with, or food shelters can apply for access to that meat. So that's how that process works. So whatever we see in a meat processor is likewise going to be represented in a food pantry during this study in 2008. So taking a look at some of the results, if we look here on the left-hand, a chart that shows, or excuse me, not a chart, a table that shows the results from commercial processors and the results from hunter processed. And if you look in the third column, and I'm going to circle the hunter processed because this is the lower amount of lead. So in the hunter samples, they were found to have, in those 8% that did have lead, they were found to have an average amount of 1.8 milligrams per kilograms. And if you look right up here, during this study, they found that consuming venison with as little as 1.8 milligrams per kilogram once a month can increase blood lead levels. If you look again at the table and look at the commercial processors, you'll notice that mean or average amount of lead that they found in the 15% of samples is much higher at 2.4 milligrams per kilogram. Consuming more lead can increase the amount of lead in the blood. So there's a direct correlation to that. And so we're seeing slightly higher numbers for our commercial processors. And according to the CDC, we've already talked about the FDA, but according to the CDC, there is no safe blood lead level in children. So if there's lead found in children's blood, that is automatically above any sort of safe level. 0 is the safest level. So just letting you know that this is, this is found in venison within Wisconsin, and it is a true concern. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to reduce that risk.
So how does lead get into venison? The main source of contamination are bullets that fragment into small pieces upon impact. As you can see from this picture, the lead bullet fragments into many, many, many tiny pieces upon impact, where the copper bullet is just one intact piece of ammunition. These were both discharged pieces of ammunition. So lead fragments, what's also problematic about lead is that if you have one carcass that has a lot of lead contamination and the meat from that carcass goes through a meat grinder, and then you have another carcass that maybe didn't have so much lead contamination or had none, and it goes through the same meat grinder, the meat grinder can effectively contaminate both of those carcasses. And so, that's another potential source of contamination of lead. As you can see here from these X-ray photos, the entry point of the bullet is in one area, and these lead fragments can get quite far away, as much as 14 inches. I've heard from the point of entry there can be lead contamination. And some of these fragments are invisible to see by the naked eye, so it's impossible to really clean everything out. An alternative to using lead ammunition is to use non-toxic ammunition. So non-toxic ammunition is made with another form of metal. I don't know if lead is actually metal, but it's made with another form of metal, such as copper, and it doesn't fragment. Some people are against non-toxic ammunition because there's a higher cost associated with it. It also travels differently through the air, and so it's important for hunters, if they're switching from lead to non-toxic ammunition, to re-sight in their guns. From the information that we've compiled related to lead ammunition, we think it's highly unlikely that deer that have been harvested with lead ammunition would be able to be sold at a retail in a retail situation or sold to federal programs. And it might require implementation of this project, and sale of venison cuts might require the use of non-toxic ammunition for harvesting the deer.
So now we're going to take a look at Waawaashkeshi-Wiiyas and the model code and that intersection there.
So as you may know, in the 1980s, the tribes sued the state of Wisconsin, and Red Cliff was a party to that case under the Lecouture versus Wisconsin case. And within the litigation of all the various different issues, the tribes and the state came to agreements on some of the issues. And one of the agreements was on the commercial sale of venison. So with respect to that aspect, the tribes agreed to hold off on selling any kind of meat cuts. So, not just a whole carcass, but any kind of processed venison until they created and implemented a regulatory system that's similar to what the state has. And so that's really what this project is about. You know, currently the only opportunity that tribal members have to sell venison is by selling a whole carcass. So we're really about providing this technical assistance in order to provide that opportunity here. Oops, I skipped a slide. This thing is really touchy. So one of the things that we looked at when we were preparing to create the model food code was to look at these state and federal standards and compare them to things that the tribes are already doing. And what we saw is things aren't very much far off. There's a big general standard that the states and the feds have related to adulteration. And that's just a fancy way of saying that food needs to be clean, wholesome, and safe. And certainly in our communities, that's a standard that our tribal members do employ. We're not providing meat to other people that isn't clean, wholesome, and safe. With respect to misbranding, it's about Dibwewin, telling the truth. Whatever you say a food is on its label, or if you give a food to someone else, you're not going to be telling them that any kind of inaccurate information. So you have to have a food label that's accurate, and it clearly depicts what is in the food package. Food processing plants. It's very exciting to see what Red Cliff is doing with its fish processing plant. You know, food that is sold at a retail level or provided to federal programs has to be prepared in a facility and like a food processing plant that complies with regulations. What we've done in the model food code is create a tribal licensing process with standards that are very similar to what the state and the feds have related to facilities. And meat inspection. So for any kind of meat that you're going to be buying at the grocery store, it has to have undergone an inspection to make sure that the animal isn't, you know, diseased, or it wasn't hurt, or the meat isn't rotten, and that it's safe for human consumption. And then, you know, there's also standards related to what you can put in food. So any kind of preservative or colors or other kind of ingredients, they need to be food safe. So all those are things that are really consistent with Ojibwe traditional ecological knowledge and the cultural traditions that we have around food. And so with this project, we've been looking at those standards and and implementing them in a way that would make sense for food that is harvested in our ceded territories. And so again, you know, another important aspect of this model code is to create standards that are consistent with the tribe's sovereignty and ability to, regulate and create their own standards. So we've created 3 classifications of food, and these classifications differ in the sort of the stringency of the regulation that goes along with each of them. For foods that are just sold among tribal members, there's there's kind of a minimal basic level of regulation, and then it goes up into the retail sales, which is the highest level of regulation that would be required. And that's for food that would be potentially sold in a grocery store to tribal and non-tribal members alike. For Class 1 regulations, one of the things that would be required is that there's just a written assurance that the processor provides to the consumer that the deer was healthy when it was harvested, and that, you know, the field processing and any kind of butchering that occurred was done in a clean environment. The personnel had clean clothes, and you know, there's some basic standards related to cleaning and sanitizing anything that is touching food. So that would, you know, that would apply. However, these could be, you know, you could potentially butcher this product in a non-licensed facility or a differently licensed facility than a food processing plant. Class 2 regulations. So this is for food that would be sold to potentially vulnerable populations, at a Head Start or an elderly feeding program. We have a lot of federal programs that purchase food in our communities, like food distribution, Head Starts, things like that. And you know, this project is aimed at providing opportunities for these programs to have more traditional foods within, you know, within their programming. The butchering, in addition to all the basic requirements, the butchering would have to be done in a tribally licensed food processing facility. And then finally, with Class 3 regulations, this is retail sale both on and off reservation. All the basic standards would apply related to cleanliness and time and temperature controls. The butchering would have to be done in a tribally licensed food facility, and then standard nutrition labeling requirements would apply related to allergens, nutrition content, weight of the package, facility name, things like that. And so just as a reminder, a food regulatory system is about, you know, these legal and economic systems, its policies, guidelines, regulations, and the purpose is really to protect the health and safety of consumers and to provide, you know, economic opportunities for people who process food.
And so now we're going to talk a little bit more about food safety concerns of venison, a little bit more on the post-harvest or after-harvest side, and ways to keep that food clean, wholesome, and safe, harvesting all the way through to consuming. As I mentioned before, when we talked about venison, there were two main categories of concerns. We now have a third one on the harvesting side, and that's bullet fragmentations in physical contaminant area. And as Philomena mentioned earlier, physical contaminants are things that could potentially cause physical harm to someone eating it. So that could be a chipped tooth or cutting of the mouth, anything along those lines. We're also going to talk about the biological concerns that we talked about earlier, and lead as well, and how to reduce those risks on the post-harvesting side. So when we look at CWD, just some general things to keep in mind is it is not recommended to eat deer which has tested positive for CWD. As Philomena mentioned earlier, typically like the lymph nodes are tested, and what we're seeing more and more in the literature is that if CWD is in the lymph nodes, it is also in the muscle tissue. So there was a time where the recommendation was to abstain from the spinal column or other places where lymph nodes might be found. We're starting to see that present in the muscle tissue as well. And so if the deer test positive for CWD, we recommend do not consume that. As we talked about earlier, it's always a good idea to clean and decontaminate your equipment and any other materials that may have come into contact with a potentially CWD positive deer. We talked about the 50-50 bleach water solution for 5 minutes, and the recommendation to clean all of that equipment well before putting it into the solution to soak for 5 minutes. And then if you can, allow it to air dry ideally. For the harvester to reduce CWD, always do your best to inspect the deer for signs of illness before the kill, immediately after the kill, and during any sort of processing, which could include field dressing. And then if you harvest in a CWD management area, it's important to test for CWD. Underneath the food code or in reference to the food code, any deer that test positive for CWD are not allowed or donation underneath the model food code. When we think about the consumer side, food handler side, or processor side, it's important to ask the harvester for location or county of harvest. That way you can identify if this is a harvest that may have come from a CWD management area. You can always ask for CWD testing, and this will be required for the CWD management areas when commercial harvest is taking place. And then the food code does require deer from CWD management areas to be held under refrigeration and not to be processed further until negative CWD test results are returned. So these are some ways to reduce the risk of CWD entering the food system. When we think about bovine tuberculosis, we've already talked about the hunter side, which is wearing a breathing mask and gloves. You can also wear long sleeves and long pants to protect yourself against any splatter of any sort of bacteria from expelled lungs, trachea, or mouth. And then cleaning and sanitizing equipment and surfaces. This is a pretty easy to kill bacteria, so you don't need to use a 50-50 bleach solution. You can use a little bit less, like about a tablespoon or 2 per gallon. That'll be plenty. Or if you have any other sanitizers, food-based sanitizers, those should work just fine. Any deer that do test positive for bovine tuberculosis cannot be sold or donated. So again, deer exhibiting signs of disease which pose a risk to human health are not allowed for sale or donation underneath the model food code. So this again is most relevant at this point in time for that upper part of the lower peninsula of Michigan right now. If you're using deer at home that you're concerned might have bovine tuberculosis, this is something that you hunted yourself and you're doing it for personal use, make sure that you cook the venison to 165 degrees, so cooking it thoroughly. And it may not be advisable for immunocompromised persons to prepare or consume meat from bovine tuberculosis infected or believed to be infected deer. For customers, food handlers, and processors, it's important for you to know the signs of the disease. We saw that photo earlier of white spots around the lungs. So knowing what the signs of the disease might be so you too can identify if there's anything that a hunter or processor may have missed. Don't purchase or handle deer carcasses or meat that comes from animals which appear to be infected with bovine tuberculosis, and ensure that you receive any required documentation from the harvester. So if they're hunting in a bovine tuberculosis area, they may have to provide some sort of documentation in order to sell that. So if there's any documentation to go along with that, make sure that you ask to receive that as well. Again, this is just a gentle reminder that this is a bacteria that is already found in the intestinal tract of the animal. So it's already there. So it's our job either as the harvester or as a food processor or as the consumer to control the growth of that bacteria. So thinking about the hunter side, this is already something that's found in the fecal matter. Sometimes we find fecal matter already on the fur. There's other ways that E. coli can kind of get on the fur, maybe when deer lay down and get back up again. So it's important to keep fur off the meat if we can do that. E. coli can cause nausea, vomiting, and bloody diarrhea, fever, and stomach cramps. So really uncomfortable. And it's especially at high risk for young children and elders who can get serious complications from E. coli. So we want to keep all carcasses and meat as cool as possible, as quickly as possible. So soon after harvest, cooling that carcass as fast as you can. If you're using ice, making sure that's coming from a clean and drinkable source. When it comes to field dressing, processing, and handling of the venison, you want to always use clean and sanitized surfaces, equipment, and hands. And I'm not doing these things, but it's important just as a quick reminder of why it's important to keep our harvest nice and cool. Harvesters are our primary defense against E. coli. Utilizing quick, clean, and sanitary environments can help reduce E. coli reduce the E. coli risk during the harvesting and field dressing portion. Utilizing clean equipment is incredibly important as well, and then avoid nicking the intestines or allowing fecal matter to come back into the cavity or the harvest during field dressing. Those are all important steps to reduce E. coli. After field dressing, it's again important to cool the carcass quickly. Some ways you can do that, or some benchmarks you can try to reach. These are just recommendations is to cool the carcass to below 70 degrees in less than 2 hours, and then to continue to cool it to less than 51 degrees in 5 hours, and then make sure it's at refrigerator temperatures within 48 hours. While those are recommendations, continuous cooling is required for commercial sales with the model code. Some techniques that you can use to reduce E. coli in the field is shot placement. So making sure that you're shooting for vital organs away from the intestines. So potentially the heart, maybe even the head. Those would be ways to keep E. coli out of the meat. Also, bung tying is a technique that can be used, and this is tying off the intestines before pulling them back through the hips, or tying off the lower colon area before you're pulling it back through the hips, can reduce any sort of fecal matter returning into the cavity. And then antimicrobial rinses are an option. This is something that's utilized in meat processing facilities already for slaughterhouses and things like that. So antimicrobial rinses are also an option. You always want to follow the instructions on the antimicrobial rinse bottle. For consumers, when we look at E. coli in the kitchen, again, keeping that meat cool or refrigerated or even frozen until it's ready for use. You can always ask your hunter about food safety practices. Again, our hunters are experts at food safety, so they're usually keeping things nice and cool, but again, it's always nice to have a reminder. And if you ask a hunter about their process, they are always proud to tell you, so don't be shy to ask. And then for yourself in the kitchen, using good hygiene and good sanitary practices. For processors and food handlers, you already know clean and sanitize is the rule. Always trying to keep things as clean and sanitized as possible, never letting that raw meat come into contact with foods that are ready to eat and serve. And then for consumers, cook that meat thoroughly. So we want to get it nice and hot, getting it closer to that 160 mark to make sure that meat is cooked all the way through. And now we're going to take a look at lead, as Philomena talked about. Ammunition that's non-toxic or doesn't have lead in it can help to reduce the amount of lead that ends up in meat. Hopefully can eliminate lead in meat. If you look at the X-ray of ballistic gelatin photo at the bottom, you'll see a line kind of in the middle. See if I can highlight it right here. That looks like a constellation of stars. This is a lead bullet that's been shot into what's called a ballistic gelatin. It's kind of like a big square of jello that's specifically designed for this type of impact, and it represents how bullets react, or how bullets move in spaces like this once they hit a target, so to speak. And as you can see, excuse me, from the lead, you can see these lead particles after it's been x-rayed, kind of broken up quite a bit and create this star constellation and move throughout the target. Where you see a vast difference here in the non-lead section, how there's no light fragments at all. So you can see that there's little or no lead fragmentation here. So just another reminder of how lead reacts once it's shot into a carcass. And so when we think about the fragmentation, so we talked about physical hazards earlier. For a hunter, it's important to make sure that you remove any visible bullets and fragments. Remember, all fragments may not be visible, but doing our due diligence to remove those fragments will really help reduce risk for physical damage to a consumer, to an eater's mouth or body. For the processor, food handler, and consumer, the hunter should be able to provide information around the type of ammunition they use. So again, asking for that information, doing your due diligence to inspect the meat for bullet fragments. As we'll see in a minute, bullet fragments can travel quite a distance away from the injury point. And so making sure that you're keeping an eye out for any sort of fragments that may have traveled to further cuts of meat is also really important. And then you also want to clean your meat grinder frequently. So we'll take a look at this picture. You've already seen this once. And again, the red area is where the bullet entered the deer carcass or the deer cavity. And you can see that this area near the neck is some of our lead fragmentation all the way over here. And you can see some lead fragmentation further down in the belly and the carcass. So you can see that there's these are spaces that a hunter might not be able to see and might not get to. So as a processor and consumer, you want to make sure that you're checking that meat for any fragments. And here's another picture of how lead can fragment throughout a carcass. So with that, wanted to let you know that for our commercial harvesters and food handlers and processors, there's HACCP plans, SSOPs, or sanitation standard operating procedures and good manufacturing practices that can be employed to reduce risks. And these are part of our model food code recommendations. And we'll be learning more about that in some upcoming trainings. So here are some information about 3 upcoming food handler and harvester trainings that will be taking place later this summer. It's completely free. It will cover all 16 traditional foods or areas of foods that we are focusing on in this project. You'll have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about those tools that I just spoke about with the HACCP plans, the SSOPs, and the good manufacturing practices. We'll also take a look at the model food code, of course, and how that intersects. And we talked a little bit about potentially there being some, maybe some information that a harvester would want to communicate to a consumer. And so we'll talk about how to meet the standards of the model food code and what kind of information a food handler should ask from a harvester, what kind of information a harvester should anticipate a food handler or a consumer asking. So we'll take a look at those, and those will start later this summer. So if you're interested, you've already signed up, just know that we will be emailing you more information about when those will happen, and they will be happening over Zoom. So this would be pretty nice.
And we will also have a food regulator and manager training. And so this is a deeper dive into the model codes. And this is geared towards people who would be the enforcers or the regulators of this particular project within tribal communities, perhaps tribal legal departments. It's free, and we're going to have it will be a series of training sessions over the course of a couple weeks. So it's you know, again, this is free, available. Any tribal member can really participate in this.
So we just wanted to go over a quick summary and open up the floor for some feedback and some questions. So in our summary, we just want to remind you that traditional foods should be available for use in tribal programs. These are safe and nutritious and should be available.
And the food regulations and geared towards food safety for these various tribal harvested foods will help make that possible.
And our project is working to make these food codes both culturally appropriate and effective. So with that, we'd like to say miigwech, and thank you so much for your time, and open up the floor for any questions that you may have. Feel free to utilize the question and answer or the Q&A section. I know we went over a lot of information, so we'll give you a little bit of time here. As Philomena mentioned, those trainings will be available for community members and tribal members. So if you're interested, just keep an eye out in your inbox as well. All right, well, I don't see any questions yet. We'll give you another couple of seconds to finish off any questions and send them our way. All right, well, I think we gave you a lot of food for thought. I don't think we have any questions coming in. If you do have questions, you can always reach out to myself or Philomena. I believe our information is on the flyer for this event. You can also find us at glifwic.org. Philomena and I are both available to answer any questions that you might have or any concerns as well. So thank you again for your time and attention. I apologize we did go over time. But thank you for sticking with us. I'd also like to, on behalf of our project, say thank you to Alyssa and the Minobemadaziwin Farm for helping us to make this webinar possible and helping us to coordinate and promote this event. So thank you guys so much. We really, really appreciate your help.
Yeah, it was great spending the afternoon. Oh, it looks like we might have one. Oh, it was miigwech. Okay, miigwech gagin.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Awesome. Well, have a good rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, miigwech.